Kehilat Shalom. So I have mentioned a number of times in my weekly Torah portion and my Drash last night what the rabbis look at when it says that Jacob is distressed and afraid about his coming confrontation with Esau, actually afraid and distressed. And the general consensus of the commentaries is that he's afraid he might be killed and distressed that he might wind up killing. And in his commentary on this verse, Rabbi Scheiheld of Yeshivat Hadar in New York says the following: not surprisingly, Jacob's fear of slaying someone, even critically someone who, so he believes, wants to slay him, is coupled with an aversion to violence and a disdain for weapons. Jacob blasts his sons Simeon and Levi for slaughtering all of the inhabitants of the city where their sister Dinah had been raped. Okay, and that's actually the first thing we'll read next year in this same parsha. For those of you who aren't familiar, Dinah, Jacob's only daughter, is raped. The guy who raped her, Hamor, fell in love with her. He wants to marry her, and it's a little hard to swallow, you know, but Jacob says, okay, but you know, you're uncircumcised, right? So if you and your family and the members of your city, if you want to intermarry with us, you have to be circumcised, right? So all the men are circumcised, and on the third day after their circumcision, while they're still recovering, right? Because adult circumcision is not a minor thing. So they're recovering and incapacitated, and Simeon and Levi come in and they kill him. Okay, which displeases Jacob immensely, and he repeats his condemnation. Rabbi Held continues to the end of his life, declaring his desire to be distanced from these two sons and what they represent. Okay. And interestingly, so Rabbi Held wrote this originally in 2014, right after he was one of about a dozen rabbis who were arrested in New York City after protesting the death of Eric Garner. If you remember, he was this African-American guy who was selling singles, unlicensed, untaxed cigarettes on the street in Staten Island, and he was killed while being arrested. Okay, and I want to bring, so that was the same year as Michael Brown was killed outside of St. Louis, and the officer who shot him was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos, and he said, "I was just following my training." He said he had a clear conscience, says, because I know I did my job right. I'm not haunted by this. It's just something that happened, right? It's just something that happened. Okay, and in my class on Thursday night, we discussed a little bit about the question of whether Jews are considered white. Okay, now, of course, when I say Jews, I mean like us, right? I mean, there are Jews who are clearly not white, right? But 80–90% of the American Jewish community are Ashkenazi Jews of European descent, right? And the question of, are we white people? Okay, let me just show of hands. Who here thinks Jews are white people? All right, who here thinks Jews are not white people? Okay, I got about half your hands think we're white and half didn't raise their hands. Okay, Now, interestingly, a lot of Jews today want to claim that we're not white, right? We're not white. Why? Because it is perceived, especially in liberal or progressive society, you know, the term white privilege, right? And we know what? We don't have white privilege, right? But through much of American Jewish history, when Jews were not considered white by the majority, okay, we struggled to be considered white, okay? As I brought up in my class, there was an immigration bill in the late 1800s that restricted the immigration of Asiatics, okay? But then there was an amendment to the bill that said that this restriction did not apply to Asiatics who were Jews, Syrians, or Armenians, okay? Do you think the Jews liked that bill? What? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, some say yes. If you say yes, why?
Because they were granted freer immigration than others.
All right, so it's good because they were allowed to immigrate despite the fact that they were Asiatics and not white, right? But Dan said no, right?
No, don't discriminate against anyone.
That wasn't the reason. That wasn't the reason, okay? You're imposing your values, okay, Michael?
Because they thought they should be considered Asiatics in the first place.
Right, exactly. What, Asiatics? We're not Asiatics, we're white, right? So it wasn't that they objected to the discrimination against non-white people, right? And it's not that they even objected to the exception for Jewish non-white people. The point was that they wanted to be considered white, right? But now a lot of Jews don't want to be considered white because we don't want to acknowledge having white privilege, right? So, I mean, you see these articles all the time, oh, what white privilege, right? My grandparents came here with nothing, right? There's still massive anti-Semitism, right? And there is massive anti-Semitism, right? I mean, the anti-Semitic vandalism, you know, and the expressions of anti-Semitism in public by very fine people like Kanye West or Nick Fuentes, right? Or, you know, the statement that, oh, Jews are ungrateful to the former president, et cetera, et cetera. So expression of anti-Semitism is far more rampant than it used to be. So what white privilege do we have, right? But white privilege, it's not about anything you did. It's not about anything your ancestors did. It doesn't mean you're wealthy. It doesn't mean that you didn't suffer, right? And it's clearly not about any sort of inherited anything at all, right? Because, I mean, how many of us had ancestors in this country when there was still slavery? Anyone? None of us, right? None of us. So we clearly don't like inherit that historic guilt, right? But nevertheless, I mean, you can like it or not like it, but if you disagree, you're simply wrong. That there are advantages that accrue to you in this society by virtue of your white skin, right? If you go into a store or if your kids go into a store, right, you are much less likely to be followed around by store security because you're white, okay? And it has nothing to do with whether your ancestors owned slaves. Right, and it has nothing to do with whether Kanye West had his Twitter account restored, right? You will be automatically less suspicious because of your skin, right? And I told some of you, I had, a few years ago, an encounter with the Montgomery County Police, and they showed up at my house, and I flatly refused to comply with their orders. And I said, I want you to get your sergeant down here, right? And I was yelling at him. I was furious, and I was yelling at him. And I said, I want you to get your sergeant down here. And I was yelling and I was stomping around. And you know what they did? They got the sergeant down. Okay. And then the sergeant explained to me what the patrol officers didn't explain properly. And I complied with what they wanted me to do. Right. And then I told a black minister what happened. And he said, you did what? I told him, you did what? I mean, how were you not arrested? I mean, said if I did something like that, I would be lucky if I was arrested, right? Because I'd be just as likely to be shot, right? Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was his reaction. That was his reaction, right? And I had jury duty in the early 90s in DC, right? And I was the foreman of the jury, right? And it was a cocaine possession case, and the defendant's defense was that they planted the cocaine on him, that they chased him, tackled him. They thought he had cocaine. He didn't. They planted it in the pocket of his jacket, right? And that was his defense. And we went to deliberate, and they voted for me to be the foreman. And there were 7 black people on the jury and 5 white people on the jury. And I took a straw vote. I said, maybe we don't even need to deliberate. Let's just vote now and see where we stand. 7 for acquittal, 5 for conviction, right? Now, why? Because all 5 of the white people on the jury said, impossible that the police planted cocaine on this guy, right? And all 7 of the black people said, you have no idea what happens in our neighborhoods, right? And you know what? I don't know, and it doesn't matter, right? Because the facts are not what matters. The perceptions and the feelings are what matters, right? And black people have a very different experience of the police than white people do, right? And eventually, I have to tell you, eventually we did it with the guy, because it was 3 years from the time of the arrest to the time of the trial. And the defendant had a very good lawyer. Right, so when the police said, the police officer said, I saw him walking down the street and he had something in his hand and he tossed it into the bushes. And the defense attorney said, oh, he had something in his hand, right hand or left hand? And the officer said, I don't remember, okay? Which he clearly, I'm sure, didn't remember because it was 3 years ago, right? But that was enough eventually to create a reasonable doubt. And because, as I said at the time, and it's not the defendant's job to prove he didn't do it, right? It's the prosecution's job to prove that he did beyond a reasonable doubt. And there was enough, reasonable doubt, right? But the point is that and this is not so much from Montgomery County, right? And when I described that incident, I saw your reaction, right? And I agree. I mean, I think the Montgomery County Police is as close to an equitable police department as we come in this country, right? But I'm sure that even in Montgomery County, there are still issues, and even with an African-American police chief, there are still issues, right? And even when there was an African-American county executive for 3 terms, there were still issues, right? Because that store detective following the black kid around the store could be a black store detective, right? It doesn't really matter. There is a price, a social price that people pay for having non-white appearance still in this country, right? And stuff can happen and no laws were broken, right? And the guy who shot Michael Brown was never charged. And there are so many cases where unarmed black people are shot and the police are not charged because they acted within the law, right? But we should really strive for a society where there is, we strive for a post-racial society, right? And that should be a goal, and it should be a goal where affirmative action is not needed because we truly live in a post-racial society, but we're not there yet. And that needs to be, I think, our goal. Shabbat Shalom. Yeah, Steve.
Several weeks ago, I asked this question, I think I was on Zoom, about the issue that frequently comes up in various conversations about whether or not being Jewish, what are we a race, are we a religion? And my question is, it's hard coming out, but it's tied to the last statement in terms of not living in a society where it's no longer significant.
Right.
And I know that companies and organizations do a data collection by asking about race and gender and age, mostly you would hope in the spirit of making efforts. But how does that idea fit into what you're saying?
Well, right, okay, so the question, as I understand it, for those of you who might not have heard, is that how does, attempt racial data collection, and it comes up in, in various forms, right? I mean, how does that tie in with the goal of a post-racial society?
But also specifically applying to us.
And especially applying to Jews, right? So look, for a long time, I resisted putting down white, okay? I now do put down white because I understand that I have the advantages of whiteness, right? Even if my ancestors suffered, right? But I mean, the goal of racial data collection is to try and ascertain that there's fairness, right? And you can only ascertain that if you know what percentage of black people are approved for a mortgage versus what percent of white people versus what percent of Latinos, et cetera, right? So, I mean, I'm very ambivalent about it, right? Because it is a bad, in my opinion, it is a bad means to a good end, right? It is a bad means to a good end. But in terms of, I go into a store and they see a white guy, right? Especially now, if I'm wearing a kippah, then they'll see a Jew, right? But if I'm not wearing, if I'm either bareheaded or wearing a hat that's not, then they don't say, oh, Jew. They say white guy, right? And certainly I've heard anti-Semitic remarks, right? And people are usually pretty careful to not say anti-Semitic remarks when they know the person is Jewish, right? So the question is, look, Jews are clearly not a race, right? I mean, ethnicity doesn't necessarily imply common descent. I mean, I think, frankly, the best answer is really try, okay? Because if you look, I mean, having come here from Southeast Connecticut, right, where we have 2 recognized tribes, the Mohegans and the Pequots, right? Get a bunch of Mohegans, they don't all look alike, right? I mean, they clearly don't have, I mean, they may be all descended from Mohegan ancestors centuries ago, but their genetics is maybe 1/64 Mohegan, right? But their identity is still very much Mohegan, especially since they got their casino,
Right.
right? But therefore, I think tribe, I mean, we're not a religion, right? Because I mean, you know, I discussed Bernie Sanders Thursday night too. Does anybody think Bernie Sanders not Jewish?
Not Jewish?
Yeah, right. I mean, just opens up his mouth, right? He's not Jewish, but he doesn't adhere to the Jewish religion, right? So we're not a religion, we're not a race. I mean, you know, is Barnaby not Jewish because he's not descended from Jews, right? Of course, he's extremely Jewish, right? So because he's a member of our tribe, and just like you can join a Native American tribe through adoption, you can join the Jewish tribe through adoption, but there isn't, that doesn't work on a form, okay? That's the problem, right? So I personally think that any of us should put white on those forms because sociologically, that's what we are. All right. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with the Kaddish before Musaf and the Musaf service, 155 in your Shabbat Siddur, 428 in the full Siddur.